Hi, this is another update of my personal blog, and I'm taking a break from doing some research and hold up the papers for you that I'm doing. I'll show them to you. For a um, theorizing on the hammer to come out in about a week on the class for itself and the class in itself for self distinction. That'll be over at Unlikely Books, where my theorizing for the hammer essays are going to go up bi-weekly now. So we're not going to do it every week anymore. It's bi-weekly. Sometime I'm going to be doing some debates soon um, in regards to MMTers. I don't. We we have blown past the last set of dates, and I think my interlocutor Max from the Superstructure podcast is kind of busy with his own academic work and his own podcast and his work over at Monthly Review. So we will probably be in discussions about when we're actually going to do that soon. We kind of got blindsided by all the madness of the election. This is why you should, when you commit to debates, you should do them pretty quickly, though, because it's becoming harder and harder for us to pin down a time. So, what's with all these updates here? I'm trying to use social media less, actually. I find that my state of mind is better, but I'm liking getting my thoughts out in a semi cogent way on my own channel. I also think it stops people from misinterpreting a lot of what I say. They have to listen and engage a little closer instead of me being forced to break it down into bite-sized bits. And I wanted to comment today on anti-intellectualism and the myth of meritocracy. I read a article by Leo Krapp and Catherine Liu from the Damage Journal called Meritocracy Antagonistes. I was not entirely impressed with the way they went about their argument. Um, there are some statements, particularly about a commitment to equality before the 1980s in the left, that literally made me laugh. Having studied a lot of Christopher Lasch in the history of the American left, the every generation is always saying that the prior generation gave up on the idea of equality. And I think you could probably find that from left activists pivoting almost as a kind of anxiety of influence against the last set of activists who failed to achieve anything in that regard by stating that, this last generation is the generation that betrayed us. Well, if you read in socialist history, that at least goes back to like the 1930s at minimum. Um, and definitely in the United States and in Europe. It's a little bit more complicated in other places. Um, lately though, I've been reading a lot about, believe it or not, like Zhou and Zhou and Qin and Han, imperials in what we call China. I've been reading about the Mesopotamian culture, such as the Chaldeans and whatnot. I mean, this is what I do in my spare time. I actually am not just, reading a socialist history. In fact, I do that as my second job, and I read poetry, comic books, um, and history for fun, and I try to balance those out, right? Because comic books are basically like depending on the comic book, the honey to bleach sugar of my informational diet. But one thing I've noticed a lot is this turn towards anti-intellectualism on a lot of the left. And well, actually, I shouldn't say it's not just, it's like across the board in American culture. But what I find interesting about that is the kind of almost bifurcation of the mind of leftists who at one hand have, and even leftists who are highly obscurantist and anti-intellectual, talk about it in very intellectualized jargon heavy ways, and I get accused of using jargon a lot too. I have a distinction between jargon and technical terms, are jargon when it's just keeping people out versus jargon when you're just trying to be specific. Those are different things, right? Um, but I just don't have a lot of patience for anti-intellectualism, particularly aimed at working class people. And while I do think there is class dynamics going on to play in all education at all times, and what people have access to and what their most likely references are, and I do think, for example, a lot of like left cultural codes about what is acceptable and unacceptable are educational and cultural capital norms. And some people. I remember the first time I said a word that can be construed as a racial slur against Roma. And I just used it to mean stealing, right? I'm not going to repeat it here. And I had no knowledge that it referred to Roma. It didn't even connect to me that it was a short form of gypsy. All right. It had been used around me for so long, I said it without having any knowledge that it had a racial undertone. Um, and that was part of my that was part of the area I swam in. People just talk that way. It was used so commonly, its sting had been lost. I mean, that's always the case with trying to change language and euphemisms. In some ways, it's George Carlin isn't wrong. It's actually kind of approaching backwards. If you try to make a word have less sting by coming up with a less problematic word, but the cultural attitudes don't change, well, the less problematic word just becomes problematic itself. The classic example of this is the various words we've used for mental incapacity that we now think of as hate speech. Almost all were softenings of a prior hate speechy word, and that's because we haven't changed the entire milieu, the social milieu around those issues enough for it not to be a problem. Um, but some of that is also just it's a form of cultural capital, and it's education involved for you to know that you are using something in this way. If it's used all the time in this other way, it's baggage is not known to you. And also, there's a bunch of social attitudes that are just beyond just that. So, but I'm a highly educated person, right? I'm just talking to you about the Chaldeans or whatever. And that's not just me being pretentious. I love to read. But my background is I'm not like a fail son of an aristocrat. My stepfather was a mechanic. Now he did come from a middle class family fallen on times, and he's a master tech. He's an excellent mechanic, but he was a mechanic. Like he was a petit bourgeois tool truck owner in the 80s. When the 80s recession hit, wiped out his business. He worked he worked for dealerships. He's been a working guy all my life. My mom was a waitress. She worked at a diner when I was a kid, and part of that time when I was a kid, I think for a brief period I lived out of her car before she met my stepdad, and after my father left her. Um, and then in the mid '80s, she got married. She was a housewife for a while. Then she was a secretary at a air conditioning plant for a little while, and then she was a waitress at a Huddle House. Not the most prestigious, jobs. She got into school when she was working at the Huddle House, and she became a nurse, for which she was only able to do for about 10 years before disability took her out of the profession. Lupus, uh, did that to her. So I was, she graduated college the literally the same year I graduated high school. Um, my father was a salesman. My grandfather was a brickmaker. My other grandfather was my mom's adopted father was a factory worker, then manager at Procter and Gamble. All right. So when I say I come from the working class, I'm not putting on airs. This is not like some red pretension, you know, stolen valor. But I myself am. I mean, I am technically from the Marxist sense. I'm a wage earner, and I work for the state. I'm a teacher, and I don't own my own business. I do occasionally sell books, I guess. books of poetry though. So I think I've made like $300 off that in 4 years. Um, so I say all that to just say uh, I used to believe in meritocracy because I got out of the social class I was from. My parents, even though I even had like I'm dyslexic and aphasic. That's why another reason I don't really love writing everything down, and my book process takes a long time, even though I have an MFA. But uh, I I come from a background where I used what I thought was a meritocratic system to improve myself. But I came to realize something that I think Lou and Crap are right about, and that I personally also observed in Max Weber. Max Weber talks about, you know, the rationalized form of pre-rational positions. So, like for example, in pre-modern times, uh, the classes were appointed by God, or that it's just the strongest, or you just had the Duke because the King gave it to you, right? Like your merit was doomed to be somewhat arbitrary by fate or blood or God's blessing. Um, and those systems occasionally got meritocratized in the space of Confucian systems and the Byzantine system. But what you notice with the meritocracy, and Weber points this out, Max Weber, the sociologist, points this out in regards to modernity, is that the people who set up the meritocracy, while it does change the nature of society, they do so in a way that favors the people who already had the resources because they can, of course, afford the tutors, protect their kids, make sure they're fed well enough, give them access and the leisure time to invest in themselves instead of toiling for somebody else. These things mean that meritocracy aren't based on natural intelligence and all that, and equal opportunity can't be equal opportunity in that way. Now, Lou and Krapp say that the focus on equality of opportunity comes with the development of the PMC. I would say horse crap, that's been a progressive um, talking point since Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, I can prove it, and the book I'm writing on Christopher Lasch goes into that. That predates the managerial class, or it is where the managerial class comes from. The PMC class, as discussed by John and Barbara Ehrenreich, um, and their vague notions are not where they developed in the 70s, 80s, is not the origins of this talk or its predominance in American society. All right, and so again, I think but even disagreeing with Lou and Crap about how this developed, and I'll put a link to this article in the show notes for you so you can make your own decisions. I think they're essentially right though that meritocracy is fundamentally a ruse. That it was always a ruse. I mean the even liberals have been turning against meritocracy, pointing out that it was originally coined as a satire on aristocracy in the 1920s. And again, showing you that this idea is not new. Um, and Weber, in his early works, pointed out that the rationalization of society was actually sort of a rationalization of position. So instead of it being arbitrary, unless you are entitled to some oblige, you earn your position in society instead of just having it by virtue of who you are. And thus having obligations placed upon you that are also arbitrary. Did they actually historically live up to those obligations of power? No, of course not. But at least they were there as a sort of mythic social check. With meritocracy, actually, a lot of that goes away. Um, and the societies that claim to be the most meritocratic are often the most unequal. I mean, look at the Gini coefficient for the United States, and I hate to tell you guys this, you look at the Gini coefficient for China, and then look at their focus on meritocracy. And Confucian meritocracy goes back a long, long time. However, in Confucian meritocracy, though, merit had obligations in ways that it doesn't in Western meritocracy. So that social system actually, I'm not here to sing the praises of Confucianism. I think it's an inherently conservative, if not reactionary, force most of the time. In my studies of of China. Like I said, I'm currently now reading on the Zhou and Han Dynasty and the early developments of Confucianism. But the Confucian meritocratic tendencies also came with strong social obligations, and those obligations were seen as vertical, and horizontal. So you had obligations to your peers and obligations to your non-peers. Now, what does this have to do, though, with anti-intellectualism? I think a lot of anti-intellectualism is resentment at the fact that a lot of us know that meritocracy is BS, so we start turning on anyone who makes us feel inferior by having a larger vocabulary or a bigger knowledge set. This is basically beat up the nerds. I don't think this is in a fundamentally egalitarian impulse. I think this is basically, kind of a form of narcissism. But it's something that you see, and I want to say, I think that impulse is damaging. But I also agree that meritocracy is rules. Even if things are fair, someone is setting up the rules of the game, so that the values that are deemed as having merit are what our virtues aren't selected by the people entering the system. They're selected by the system who was set up by the people who benefited from it in the first place. And you can see the problems there. So, one of the reasons why I am been an advocate for socialism is not because I believe we can all somehow just live together in utopia and work without incentive to work. I just don't think market incentives are actually the greatest incentives to work. And in fact, there's study after study that says if, at a lot of ways, they're not. Furthermore, I don't believe in meritocracy anymore. I've seen too much. I could go into stories. One of the things about me is I went to state school. I came from a working class background, but I just kept on working hard enough and getting recognized enough, and frankly having connections. I mean, that really does help. One of the things I had to learn is how to charm people in the right social class, and it's a reality, guys. Like, if someone tells you they don't do that and they got up in the world, they're lying. I one time talked about Janet Vance's Hillbilly Elegy when I was so mixed about it because I disagree with the course's politics. I thought its description actually of working class Ohio life, as well as some of the memory of hillbilly life, which I do think Vance is appropriating, is accurate. Actually, I mean, I think it's fairly accurate. I think but I noticed that Vance hid his own advantages in the discussion of the book. So he didn't mention the senator who helped him once he got out of his very specific military post, which his specific military post also was not a grunt military post. It was an infantry, and that gave him a lot of advantages, and he was able to work that because he's a smart man and he knew how to hustle. Whether or not you agree with his politics, one of the things his book hides is it does make it seem like that there's a fundamentally meritocratic system to which these hillbillies and poor people in Ohio could have gone into, but there isn't. That there's no place for that. Like, someone working in would need help. They need noblesse oblige. They need to impress the right people, or they're not going to get anywhere. And the same was true with me. I had a conservative professor who helped me get a job at a university in Korea, and then I started becoming closer and closer to the people who worked in the Ivy League. I had a lot of friends at University of Chicago that I met in Korea, etc. And what I learned about the Ivy League was disheartening. One of the things was that I had actually believed that all these people that I had met, working my way to get my MFA, working my way into the PhD program that I left to go abroad and teach at a university and all that, I had been led to believe that they were all there because they were inherently, they'd done the work, and they had done work. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a long process of basically indentured servitude and gaslighting involved in a PhD program, but you didn't have to necessarily be intuitively intelligent or have a lot of innate merit or even necessarily work hard prior to get some of those positions. One of the things we did, it was a constant job. even for professors, even in the from the institution, like we weren't, and I'm not. This wasn't even corruption. Is, our rich students would, we ran a clinic where rich students would pay the school to have us look over their papers and help them fix them as tutoring. But I can tell you, a lot of times it was rewriting. Um, so again, were those students dumb? No. Were they doing it all on their own? No, absolutely not. If they have money, could they get additional help to make sure that they had a leg up and thus acquire the merit? Totally. Equality of opportunity, thus, is a ruse. And it's why it's sold so much, is because you can set up, you can skew the playing field without actually completely breaking the rules. So I think that's why a lot of people resent, um, intellectualism. I think there's a lot of reasons why people resent intellectualism is beyond just that. But the rule of experts who have the merit of being experts, well, when you realize that some of those people are corrupt or venial or maybe just aren't as smart as you thought, and the whole system, even if people are doing real work and really can do what they say they're going to do, which, in some places is just replaced with bribes, to be honest. But not, but even without bribes and formal corruption, that it's still not fair. Anyway, like and subscribe. Follow me over at Zero Books. I'm probably gonna go back to Pop the Left in a month. Uh, Take care and hit the bell if you want to get updates on this. I'm not gonna update this every day like I'm doing right now, and I'm gonna finally probably start talking about things other than politics soon. But I hope that you um, get something out of this and take away some stuff about like the way cultural capital works, the way meritocracy is kind of a false bill of goods. But if you're someone like me who worked at your way out of that out of class, you tend to believe it, or at least believe that it's in general because you were able to do it, and you tend to resent the implication that it wasn't just you who got you where you are because you had to work so much harder than the people with the same position, right? And that's true for me too, and that was true for me a lot. I think that's a lot of reasons why paleoconservatism was really attractive to me in my early 20s, is because like I busted my butt to get where I was. All right. With that said, I hope you guys take something away from this and um, uh, can start not believing that there's a meritocratic progressivism that we can all believe in. And again, like I said, I don't always like the way people try to paint these as new problems. I think this is a 150-year-old problem, and it occurs in multiple societies. Like I said, I was using, early, early Chinese imperial culture. I could go into some Byzantine and Ottoman stuff about this too if I wanted to. So it's not even unique to our own period, but the form of it that we have, this current rationalized form of it with no obligations, is sort of unique to capitalist modernity. And so it's something I want you to think about.